it's really hard to tell Americans hold tight when you're a billionaire. It's really hard to listen to the president of the United States tell you when it's a holiday season, maybe only buy a couple of gifts for your kids, and that's really rich coming from someone who is literally rich. And I think Americans have reason to take pause with that and have concerns with that. Affordability is a real issue. I still hear Americans who say they're living paycheck to paycheck. And guess what? High level paychecks, $100,000 or more, we're seeing statistics that is living paycheck to paycheck for a lot of people still. And you can think about, oh, well, people don't handle their finances. Well, let's not put the blame on the American people. People live in high, in metropolitan areas that are really expensive to live in. And that is a signal to the president of the United States, like, hey, if people are making $150,000 a year and they're still struggling, what does that mean for the rest of Americans? And the majority of Americans aren't even making that much. And so living paycheck to paycheck and affordability.
You just watched a Republican strategist absolutely eviscerate the central mythology of Donald Trump's entire political existence, and it needs to sink deep into your consciousness. What a devastating and revelatory moment this is, because the fissures within the conservative movement are not mere cracks in the facade, but tectonic fractures threatening to swallow the entire edifice of plutocratic populism whole, while millions of working Americans finally confront the brutal reality that they have been gaslit, manipulated, and utterly betrayed by a billionaire carnival barker who promised them economic salvation and delivered nothing but deeper debt and accelerating desperation. Trump has repeatedly argued the affordability issue is an epic scam conjured up by Democrats, and this alone should tell you everything you need to know about the moral bankruptcy of a man who built his entire campaign around promising to make America affordable again, only to turn around months into his second term and dismiss the crushing economic anxiety of ordinary people as a political hoax. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, and what you're witnessing in this viral clip is a Republican operative finally admitting what progressive economists have been screaming from the rooftops for decades, which is that the emperor has no clothes and the supposed business genius cannot deliver relief to the people who need it most. Listen to the language this strategist deploys, because it cuts right through to the ideological heart of what makes Trump's economic charade so morally reprehensible and politically unsustainable. The strategist calls Trump really rich, and points out the obscene irony of a billionaire telling struggling families to buy fewer Christmas gifts for their children during a season that should symbolize abundance and generosity, but instead has become a referendum on whether you can afford to participate in basic rituals of American middle-class life. About a fifth of U.S. households that earn more than $150,000 a year are living paycheck to paycheck, and when six-figure earners are dedicating virtually all their income to necessities, we are not talking about personal financial mismanagement. We are talking about systemic economic violence, perpetrated by a governing class that redistributes wealth upward, while lecturing working people about bootstraps and belt-tightening and personal responsibility. 48% of consumers earning more than $100,000 annually say they live paycheck to paycheck, and this statistic should radicalize every single person who hears it, because it demonstrates conclusively that the problem is not individual profligacy, but structural inequality embedded in housing costs, healthcare expenses, education debt, and stagnant wages that have not kept pace with productivity gains for 50 years. The strategist continues with even more devastating precision, pointing out that grocery costs are up 2.7% for the year ending in September, and electricity costs have jumped more than 5%, which are not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, but real dollars disappearing from family budgets, while Trump administration officials peddle fantasies about economic prosperity and a new golden age that exists only in the delusions of Mar-a-Lago sycophants and cable news propagandists. What makes this moment so explosive is that it represents a Republican strategist weaponizing empirical reality against the president's delusional narratives, and this is precisely the kind of internal ideological warfare that progressives must amplify and exploit, because it exposes the fundamental contradiction at the core of the modern Republican project, which promises economic populism to working-class voters while delivering tax cuts for billionaires and austerity for everyone else. Trump faces an almost impossible task in trying to convince Americans the affordability crisis they experience each day doesn't exist. After all, candidate Trump told them it does, and this paradox is politically fatal because you cannot simultaneously campaign on solving a problem and then deny that problem exists once you hold power without alienating the very constituency that elevated you to office in the first place. Now let's talk about the personnel and the policy, because Musk's net worth is estimated above $400 billion, and he chairs a commission designed to slash federal spending, which means the richest man in human history is determining which social programs get eviscerated to pay for tax cuts that disproportionately benefit people exactly like himself, while Trump stocks his cabinet with billionaires and hedge fund managers and financial services executives who have literally never experienced economic precarity in their entire lives. Isaac Mann, another financial services billionaire, was the first wealthy individual to take a spacewalk through Musk's company, SpaceX. This choice, as much as any, illustrates Trump's lean to the wealthy private sector, and when your administration looks like a roster of Forbes 400 members, you would have forfeited any claim to representing the interests of working Americans, and yet somehow Trump continues to market himself as the champion of the forgotten man, even as he surrounds himself with people whose personal wealth could fund social programs that would transform millions of lives. The sheer audacity of this performance would be impressive if it weren't so morally grotesque and economically catastrophic. What this GOP strategist understands, and what Democrats must articulate with clarity and fury, is that Trump successfully tapped into anger over the cost of living in the 2024 election and promised voters he would swiftly bring down prices, even if that was never realistic in the first place, which means the entire campaign was built on a foundation of deliberate deception and magical thinking that any serious economist could have debunked in 30 seconds, but Trump sold it anyway, because his political genius lies not in policy expertise, but in emotional manipulation and the exploitation of legitimate grievances that he has no intention or capacity to address. Trump was able to win a second term based on voters' memories of the pre-pandemic economy and more bold promises that he could fix prices on everything from gas to eggs, starting on day one, but he can't. In fact, he never could, and now we're watching in real time as the contradictions metastasize and the polling collapses, and even Republican strategists start sounding like Elizabeth Warren, because the material conditions of people's lives will not bend to Trump's reality distortion field, no matter how many Truth Social posts he fires off, or how many rallies he holds, where he gives himself an A+++++, while families ration medication and skip meals and work multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. The clip highlights something even more insidious, which is the class dimension of the affordability crisis, and how it reveals the lie of meritocracy in contemporary American capitalism. The strategist mentions people earning $150,000 who are struggling, and makes the critical point that if people are making $150,000 a year and they're still struggling, what does that mean for the rest of Americans? This is not an invitation to diminish the suffering of lower-income workers, but rather an acknowledgement that when even relatively high earners cannot achieve financial security, we have reached a point of systemic failure that demands radical intervention, not cosmetic adjustments to the tax code or performative gestures about deregulation. The median income of Americans after inflation has been stuck since 2019. In 2024 dollars, the median household income was $83,260 in 2019 and $83,730 in 2024, which means that despite all the rhetoric about economic growth and recovery, wages have essentially flatlined for half a decade, while costs have exploded and productivity has increased and corporate profits have soared and executive compensation has reached obscene heights, but workers see none of those gains because we live in an economy designed to extract value from labor and concentrate it in the portfolios of the already wealthy. The bottom 50% of Americans receive just 2.5% of capital income, but the top 10% pocketed 88% of that fast-rising capital income, including 52% for the top 1%, and these numbers should provoke revolutionary fury because they document with mathematical precision the mechanics of class warfare being waged by the rich against everyone else under the guise of free market capitalism. When Trump tells people affordability is a hoax while his billionaire cabinet members plan cuts to Medicaid and nutrition assistance, he is not merely being callous or out of touch, he is actively participating in a project of wealth extraction that requires the immiseration of millions to sustain the grotesque accumulation of a tiny elite. This is not conspiracy theory, this is just political economy, and the fact that a Republican strategist is articulating these dynamics on mainstream media suggests that the contradictions have become too glaring to ignore even for operatives whose careers depend on maintaining the fiction of Republican economic competence. Now here's where it gets even more devastating, because Trump told the crowd in Mount Pocono Pa that he believed the term affordability was a hoax perpetrated by Democrats, and this represents such a fundamental misreading of political reality that it borders on political malpractice because 7 in 10 Americans say the cost of living in their area is unaffordable, including nearly half of Republicans, which means Trump is gaslighting his own base about their lived experiences, and Democrats win elections by campaigning on this exact issue, which gives the opposition party their best opening in years, because Trump has handed them the perfect issue on which to run aggressive populist campaigns that contrast Democratic proposals to expand social programs and raise wages and tax the rich against Republican policies that demonstrably make life more expensive for ordinary people. After sweeping wins by Democrats in last week's elections where the cost of living was a key issue, Trump suddenly had a lot to say about affordability, but he has frequently come across as dismissive and defensive, and you can see the panic setting in among Republican operatives who understand that you cannot win elections by telling voters their problems are imaginary. Donald Trump will probably meet the same fate in the midterms if he faces the same situation. The president has squandered his polling on the economy, and this is where the strategic incompetence of the Trump administration becomes politically lethal, because even setting aside the moral dimensions of lying to struggling families about their economic reality, it's just bad politics to deny the existence of a problem that millions of people experience every single day when they check their bank accounts or visit the grocery store or pay their rent. Political consultant and pollster Frank Luntz says Trump risks appearing out of touch if he continues to claim that affordability is a hoax when Americans feel like they're paying more and actually do pay more, and when you've lost Frank Luntz on messaging, you've lost the entire Republican establishment, because this man has spent decades crafting focus-grouped language to make conservative policies sound palatable, and even he cannot spin this disaster. Let's excavate the historical parallels, because what we're witnessing is nothing less than the collapse of the Republican Party's decades-long con job, convincing working-class voters that conservative economic policy serves their interests when in fact, it systematically redistributes resources away from labor toward capital, away from the poor and middle class toward the wealthy, away from communities toward corporations. The Republican Party remains, incorrigibly, a vehicle for the wealthy, as one conservative writer admitted, after years of hoping Trump would transform the GOP into a genuine working-class party, and this represents a rare moment of honesty from within conservative intellectual circles that progressives must seize upon and amplify because it validates everything the left has been saying about Republican economic policy since Reagan launched his assault on unions, working people 40 years ago. Trump's proposals would, on average, lead to a tax cut for the richest 5% of Americans and a tax increase for all other income groups, and when independent analyses consistently show that your tax plans make the rich richer and everyone else poorer, you have completely abandoned any pretense of populist economic policy. The billionaire cabinet is not incidental. It is definitional of what Trumpism actually represents beneath all the populist rhetoric and performative outrage. Financial Times economics columnist Martin Wolf nicely termed Pluto-populism, when the GOP passed the 2017 tax cuts that this bill extends, is alive and well. That populist rhetoric is being married to plutocratic policies is still not recognized widely enough, and this terminological precision matters, because it names the exact nature of the ideological deception at work here, which is the deployment of working-class aesthetic and rhetoric to advance policies that exclusively benefit the wealthy, while actively harming the constituencies Trump claims to represent. When Trump surrounded himself with billionaires and then told working people that affordability was a hoax, he revealed the entire game, and now Republican strategists are breaking ranks because they understand the electoral consequences of being exposed as frauds. After Trump's term in office, the rate of white working-class support for the Republican presidential candidate fell for the first time since 2008. Trump's presidency actually reversed the long-term trend of growing GOP support within this voting bloc, which means that contrary to all the mythology about Trump realigning American politics and cementing Republicans as the party of the working class, the data suggests he actually performed worse with these voters than previous Republican candidates, and the entire narrative of Trump's unique appeal to working-class Americans may be a media construction rather than an empirical reality. This matters enormously because it means Democrats can win these voters back, not by triangulating toward some imaginary center, but by running aggressive campaigns on economic populism that directly address material concerns about housing and health, care and wages and education, while drawing explicit contrasts with Republican policies that serve billionaires at everyone else's expense. Here's what makes this moment so pregnant with political possibility and why progressives need to mobilize around this issue with maximum intensity. A new NPR/PBS News Marist poll finds 70% of Americans say things have become too unaffordable and have a dim outlook on the economy, and Democrats are slightly more trusted to handle the economy than Republicans, 37% to 33%. That's not a wide margin, but it's a sharp turnaround from the 16-point advantage Republicans had on the question in 2022. which means the traditional Republican advantage on economic issues has completely evaporated, and we are in genuinely unprecedented political territory where Democrats can credibly position themselves as the party of economic competence and working-class interests. GOP approval of Trump's handling of the economy has dropped 9 points since March, from 78%, then to 69% now, as overall public approval of his economic agenda sinks to a record low of 31%. And when you're losing your own party on your signature issue, you are in deep political trouble with no obvious path to recovery. The material conditions are deteriorating. The typical U.S. household must now spend $208 more than they did in September 2024 to buy the same goods and services. That's almost $2,500 in increased costs per year. And these are not abstractions. These are rent increases and grocery bills and medical expenses and childcare costs and utility payments that force families to make impossible choices between competing necessities. And when Trump dismisses these concerns as a Democratic hoax, he reveals such profound contempt for working people that even Republican operatives cannot defend it, because they understand you cannot win elections by gaslighting voters about the single most important issue in their lives. The strategist in this clip is not some liberal plant or secret Democrat, but a Republican professional who recognizes political reality and understands that Trump's messaging represents electoral suicide for the party. And what makes this so delicious from a progressive perspective is watching conservatives eat their own as the internal contradictions of Pluto-populism become impossible to sustain. Getting inflation to slow down or prices to drop will be easier said than done for the Trump administration, which has embraced economic policies such as tariffs that force prices upward. Trump administration tariffs have increased prices on a number of items, from food to clothing to furniture, and this is where the policy incompetence compounds the political malpractice, because Trump's signature economic initiative actively makes the affordability crisis worse while he simultaneously denies the crisis exists, which creates a doom loop of rising costs, defensive messaging, and collapsing credibility that no amount of campaign rallies or social media bluster can reverse. Trump's plan to deport millions of immigrants could also boost inflation, as employers would likely face higher wages due to a labor crunch. Trump's plan to levy a 10% tariff on all imports and 60% or more on Chinese goods shipped to the U.S. could add $1,700 a year in additional costs for a typical middle-class household, according to nonpartisan economic analysis, which means the very policies Trump touts as economic populism will actually increase costs for working families by thousands of dollars per year, while his tax cuts flow overwhelmingly to the wealthy and corporations. What the strategist articulates so powerfully is the empathy deficit at the core of Trumpism, which manifests as a billionaire president telling working people to reduce Christmas spending during a holiday season that has become a referendum on economic participation and class status in American life. This is not just politically tone-deaf, it is morally monstrous, and it reflects the fundamental disconnect between Trump's gilded penthouse existence and the lived reality of families who work multiple jobs and still cannot afford basic necessities. Furman, who served in the Obama administration, says the messaging team in that White House was very cautious not to brag about the economy as the nation emerged from the Great Recession, because they thought anything we said positive about the economy risked people thinking President Obama was out of touch, and this demonstrates that Democratic administrations understand the political imperative of validating people's economic struggles even when macro indicators look positive, whereas Trump cannot help himself from boasting about an economy that most Americans experience as deeply dysfunctional. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, RGA, told PBS NewsHour, affordability, or the lack of ability of Americans to afford the cost of living, is not a Democrat hoax, and when Marjorie Taylor Greene of all people is breaking with Trump on economic messaging, you know the political situation has become genuinely dire, because this woman has been one of Trump's most zealous defenders on virtually every other issue. But even she understands, you cannot gaslight people about grocery bills and rent checks without destroying your credibility. Greene said gaslighting the people and trying to tell them that prices have come down is not helping. It's actually infuriating people, because people know what they are paying at the grocery store. They know what they're paying for their kids' clothes and school supplies. They know what they're paying for their electricity bills. And this represents such a devastating indictment from within Trump's own coalition that it should be featured in every Democratic campaign ad from now until Election Day, because it establishes that even Trump's most loyal supporters recognize he is lying about the economy. The clip also touches on metropolitan areas and cost of living, which opens up crucial conversations about housing policy and wage stagnation, and the geographic dimensions of economic inequality that progressives must center in their analysis. People living in expensive metropolitan areas faced crushing housing costs that consume half or more of their income, even when they earn six-figure salaries. And this is not a function of poor personal financial management, but rather the inevitable result of decades of underinvestment in housing construction, restrictive zoning laws, financialization of real estate, and wage suppression that has left housing costs completely disconnected from earning power for huge swaths of the population. When the strategist says, "Let's not put the blame on the American people," that represents a crucial rhetorical intervention against conservative talking points that attribute economic struggle to individual moral failing rather than systemic policy choices and structural inequality. In a recent Quinnipiac University poll, 57% of voters blamed Trump for the economy, while only 34% blamed former President Joe Biden, and the lived reality is getting bleaker every day. 61% of Americans said the economy is not working for them, and that 70% said the cost of living where they are is not very affordable or isn't affordable at all. And these numbers represent a complete collapse of Trump's economic credibility, less than a year into his second term, which suggests that the 2026 midterms could be an absolute bloodbath for Republicans if Democrats run aggressive campaigns that center economic populism and draw explicit connections between Republican policies and rising costs. The political opportunity here is extraordinary because Trump has essentially written the Democratic campaign script by denying the existence of problems that overwhelming majorities of Americans, including Republicans, experience every single day. What makes this Republican strategist's intervention so valuable is that it provides Democrats with permission structure to go even harder on economic populism, because when conservatives themselves admit that affordability is a crisis and Trump is failing to address it, progressives can point to address it. Progressives can point this as validation of everything we've been saying about Republican economic policy for decades. This is not partisan spin, this is not media bias, this is not Democratic propaganda. This is a Republican operative stating plainly that the emperor has no clothes and working people are suffering under policies designed to enrich the already wealthy. Voters will take it out on you if you do not make their lives feel better. Right now it's very clear that the president has squandered his polling on the economy. I'm just not convinced that the one big beautiful bill, the tax act that they did past year, is actually going to change people's feelings going into next year, and this assessment from a GOP strategist should terrify Republicans and energize Democrats, because it confirms that Trump's legislative agenda will not solve the affordability crisis, and voters will punish the party in power accordingly. The video crystallizes something that needs to be said, loudly and repeatedly, which is that billionaires fundamentally cannot empathize with or effectively govern on behalf of working people, because they inhabit completely different material realities, and when Trump tells families to buy fewer Christmas gifts, he reveals the vast chasm between his penthouse perspective and the lived experience of families who budget for months to afford holiday celebrations. It was some feat for Donald Trump, a billionaire with his own airliner, who lived in an eponymous skyscraper in liberal New York and wintered in a Florida palace, to brand himself as the conservative champion of working Americans, and the fact that this branding worked for a while makes the current collapse all the more politically devastating, because Trump built his entire political identity on economic competence and connection to working-class concerns, and now both pillars of that identity are crumbling in real time as families experience the disconnect between his rhetoric and their reality. This is the kind of moment progressives need to seize and weaponize relentlessly, because it exposes the core lie of Republican economic populism while providing empirical validation for left economic analysis and policy proposals. When Trump is facing significant erosion among his Make America Great Again MAGA supporters, while also suffering backlash to his deportation and economic policies, as the country heads toward the 2026 midterm elections, these trends may threaten the Republican Party's efforts to maintain control of Congress. We are watching the collapse of the Trump coalition in real time, and Democrats must capitalize by running aggressive campaigns centered on material issues like wages, housing, healthcare, and economic security, while drawing explicit contrasts with Republican policies that serve billionaires at everyone else's expense. The Republican strategist in this clip has done half the work already by acknowledging the crisis and Trump's failure to address it. Now Democrats need to complete the work by offering a comprehensive alternative vision that centers working people rather than wealthy elites and makes the 2026 midterms a referendum on whose side politicians are really on. This moment right here, this viral clip of a Republican strategist torching Trump on economic lies, represents exactly the kind of fissure in conservative messaging discipline that can crack open entire new lines of political attack and force conversations that Republicans would prefer to avoid about who actually benefits from their policies and who pays the price. Progressives need to understand that we are living through a rare moment of ideological vulnerability for the right, where their own operatives are admitting in public that the emperor has no clothes, and working families are suffering, and Trump has no answers. We must exploit this moment with maximum aggression by centering economic populism in every campaign and every speech and every policy proposal, while forcing Republicans to defend the indefensible reality of billionaire rule and accelerating inequality and crushing unaffordability that their policies have created. The material conditions are on our side, the polling is shifting in our direction, and even Republican strategists are breaking ranks. So now is the time to press the advantage and build a multiracial working-class coalition around bread-and-butter economic issues that transcend cultural divisions and unite people around their shared class interests against the billionaire class that Trump represents and serves.